Vocês estão nos ouvindo aí? Quem fala português, câmbio.
Yes, we can hear. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are here, gathered here today. We're logging in from the UNDP office in New York, and we're very happy to have a great group of presenters here today talking on the topic of saving big forests to save the planet, the importance of intact forests and the stewards of those intact forests who are here with us to share about their work and their priorities and needs. I wanted to welcome you. I wanted to remind everyone we have interpretation in 4 languages. We have Russian, Portuguese, Spanish, and French. And you can go to the bottom of your screen. You'll see a globe. It says interpretation. You can select the language you want to listen in, and you'll be able to hear the conversation today. So I wanted to give you an overview of how our next hour and a half is going to go. We're very happy to have you all with us. Thank you for being here. We're here to celebrate this wonderful book that my friend and colleague John Reid and the late Thomas Lovejoy have written. It's an incredible book that describes in a very powerful, meaningful way what intact forests are and why we must protect them to reach all of our climate and biodiversity goals and really for the future of our children and the planet. So I'm very honored to be here to be able to feature this book and also link it to our work with the Forest Declaration platform, with all of the work that Nature for Development and Nature, Climate, and Energy unit of UNDP is doing, and all of our colleagues. So today we have John Reid, as I mentioned, the author of the book, and I'm going to share his bio with you quickly, because I'm nervous to remember it by heart. John Reid, who is here with us, founded Conservation Strategy Fund, winner of the 2012 MacArthur Award for Creative and Effective Institutions. He's a senior economist for Nia Tero, partners in this event with us, which supports Indigenous guardianship of vital ecosystems. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Scientific American, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and The Atlantic, among other outlets. He lives in Sevastopol, California. Welcome, John.
Thank you
for being here. I also wanted to introduce my co-moderator, Claire Rivera Paz, who is with UNDP, and she's a senior advisor on climate and forests and a longtime supporter and ally to Indigenous peoples and local communities, and has done a lot of work around the world saving the forest, the rainforest. We have here with us Pavel Sulendziga. I'm going to find Pavel's bio. Mr. Pavel Sulendziga is the chairperson of the board of the International Development Fund of Indigenous Peoples in Russia, also known as Batani, and is currently a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College. He was a member of the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation and advisor to the president of RIPON, which is the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Siberia, and Far East. And Mr. Pavel Sulendziga is Udege. Welcome. Здравствуйте, Pavel. We also have with us our delegation from the Amazon rainforest, Miss Angela Caxiana, who is a leader from the Brazilian Amazon. She's from the Caxiana people of the Caxiana-Tanayana Indigenous Reserve, located in the northern tip of the state of Pará at the Brazil-Suriname border. She's a member of the executive coordinating team of the Coordenação das Organizações dos Indígenas da Amazônia Brasileira, COIAB, or in English, the coordinating committee of the organizations of the indigenous peoples of the Brazilian Amazon, which is a member organization of APIB, COICA, and other regional and global organizations. And last but not least, my friend and colleague, Beto Marubo, who is from the Marubo peoples in the Vale do Javari, the second largest tidal territory in Brazil. He is a representative of the Union of Indigenous Peoples of the Javari Valley, and works on a variety of issues, including the protection of isolated peoples. This is his third time here at the Permanent Forum. Welcome to all of you. Really wonderful to have you here. I look forward to a rich discussion. We'll hear from our presenters. We'll hear a little bit from the book. We'll hear from the Indigenous peoples, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Thank you for being here. I turn it over to my colleague, Claire Rivera-Paz. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Nina, and good morning, John. Good morning to the panelists, to our distinguished panelists, and to everyone that has joined to this virtual hybrid event. It's a challenge to do that, a mixed virtual and in-person event, but we're learning as we go, and we're trying to best that we can in these conditions. So I'm here on behalf of the Forest Declaration Platform and our partners, Climate Focus, Climate Advisor, Meridian Institute, and of course UNDP. And also we'd like to recognize our colleagues of the Forest for Life partnership, Stephanie Wang from WCS, and other organizations that are part of this alliance that is working to protect intact forests. And of course the Nia Tero Foundation that is where John works. So, and I believe we are at a very critical junction right now. We're facing multiple crises at the same time: the climate, biodiversity, health, and socioeconomic crisis. And saving the big remaining forests of the planet it becomes more imperative than ever. We have a little time, and we have many compelling reasons to do so. It's demonstrated, as this book so wonderfully narrates. It's if we don't save the big forests, we're not going to solve the biodiversity and climate crisis. As simple as that. So we need to join efforts, and of course, Indigenous peoples, as the guardians of these forests, are the critical allies and the champions. And we are really excited to have this conversation where we will explore in depth how to link these two agendas: the conservationists and economists and ecologists that are working.
I'm turning it off. Just give me trying to figure out how to do it.
With the Indigenous peoples fight to save the forest and their territories. So welcome you all, and we hope we're going to have a very interesting session this morning. I hand over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire and Nina, and thanks to all of you folks out there in Zoom land. It's great to have you. A special thanks to Pavel, Beto, and Angela for being here today. They're the folks who grew up in these forests that we're going to be talking about today, and it's a pleasure that I have to be able to work with them, and also their wisdom was crucial in putting together the thinking in this book. So thank you very much, panelists, for being here. I want to thank, of course, UNDP and my colleagues at Nia Tero for supporting this effort. We did one of these events yesterday, and we had a lot of open microphones, so I want to remind folks to mute your microphones. Also remind you, if you have questions, to put them in the chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the remarks of the panelists. So with that, I think I'm going to share my screen and take us first to the Amazon. So for me, this book really was born on a trip to the Amazon when I was in this is the Upper Rio Negro in Brazil, and I had this vantage point from the top of a big rock looking out over the forest that just went on for seemingly forever. And this is a forest that is under the guardianship, the care of Indigenous people. So everything you can see in this photo, and if you turned around and looked in the other direction, everything you could see is the Upper Rio Negro Indigenous territory, which is one of many in Brazil where the work of coexisting with the forest and protecting it is happening as we speak. And that was a big motivation for me behind undertaking this book, was to sort of have a counter narrative to the terrible news that we have all the time about how the whole thing is burning down all over the world. And that feeds into sort of an existential despair that is going to take away the energy that we need to succeed in these efforts. So I teamed up with my late colleague Tom Lovejoy, who's was a true elder of our movement, and it was an immense privilege to be able to work with Tom on what would turn out to be his last book. And what we did was let's see, let me make this slide go. Okay. So what we did is we decided to look at the 5 biggest continuous forests that we still have on our planet. The work was the basis for this was done by geographers, spatial analysis experts, ecologists over the preceding couple of decades when satellite imagery became wildly more available than it had been in previous times. And we had the computing power to analyze every pixel, every 30 by 30 meter pixel to see what was there. And so mapping has really exploded. And so we're standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who did the work to figure out where are the forests in our world still intact. And so that's the dark shading on this is a certain category of forests that have the most minimal incursion of roads, industry, and the other kind of things that compromise the ecological and biophysical functions of the forest. And I think our entry point in here was thinking about these linked biodiversity and climate crises that Nina mentioned and Clea too in their openings. But quickly, it became very evident that this was a human story. I mean, that's obvious to any of us who've worked in conservation. And so along with our accumulated decades of conservation experience and the scientific literature that's out there, there were other streams of knowledge that we tried to have flowing into this book. And those streams of knowledge are the knowledge of the indigenous peoples who have lived in these forests since before anybody can remember. And so from the tropics, I want to take you to the far north, to the North American, what we call the North American megaforest, which is a combination of boreal and temperate forest, to the Yukon territory. And when I got to the Yukon on a research trip in the early winter of 2019, I met these 2 elders, Clifford McLeod and John Aklak, and they're sitting here in their 4-wheeler out in the bush to a spot that they took us to tell us about the annual round they made when they were young, following different resources around the territory. And one of the first questions I remember asking them is, how do you say forest in your language? This is the Cascadena language. And the 2 of them kind of looked at each other and they started talking in Casca, and they started telling jokes, and it sounded like maybe, I mean, I was guessing the jokes were at my expense. And they consulted a young white guy who's been living in their territory for a long, long time and speaks fluent Casca. And I was wondering, why is it so hard to answer my question? I just asked them, how do you say forest? And there's forest everywhere here. And so finally they came up with a term which means densely spruced. So spruce trees, the black and white spruce are the dominant tree in the North American boreal. And they're the trees in the background that you can see here. So that was it. It was It was a descriptive phrase, it wasn't a noun, but they weren't really satisfied, I could tell. And so the question sort of lingered over into the next day. And the next day they came up with another phrase that they were happier with. And that phrase is dechinta, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. And it means among the sticks. So in Casca, there is no noun for forest. What it is it's a situation. Forest is a coming together of a human being in a certain environment. And that relationship, that moment, is forest. And for the Indigenous colleagues who are on this call, I'm sure that there's no shortage of examples in your mind of things that you can say in your native language that you can't really say in English, or you have to contort it into a different sort of an idea. And this interaction was typical of attempts to translate what we were learning from peoples in different parts of the world into the language that we were writing the book in. And for a moment, it made me, I have to admit, insecure about the whole undertaking, that we're going to write a book about this thing we call forest, which is, we think, a bunch of trees together in one place. And the concept of the people who live in the places that we're calling forest is something different. There's no separation between the group of trees and the lakes and the sky and the mountaintops and the tundra that's adjacent to it. So that's all by way of saying that as we try to move forward as a community and do something good for the Earth's forests, we have to have these streams of knowledge building our efforts. And I encountered situations where there were no words for forest and others where there were lots of words for forest. And so the next place I'm taking you is to the forests of West Papua on the island of New Guinea. And this is a person named Finche Momo who's in the book. And we went out to the forest with her and with her little niece, Anastasia, and her sister. And they took us around a forest that they called Tof. And Tof is the forest where they gather the food, they gather supplies for everything they need in their life. And they have garden plots too. So where she's standing right now is a garden plot that was abandoned 30 years ago to plant their crops in a different spot. And of course, her people have been rotating around the landscape for tens of thousands of years in just this way. But when I asked the forest question to Finche and another person who was guiding us, she had some other words too. And so there were, if you were in a forest that was what we might call primary forest, which is a totally imprecise term, they would maybe call that arin or atrau, depending on their clan. And if it was a place that was a more secret or sacred forest, they would call it mos. But mos can also mean nature in the sense of the whole universe. And then there's a word for land, and land and forest are synonymous. And so that word is tabam. And it's worth noting that the language, the Mabrat language in which she speaks, is one of 1,300 languages in New Guinea, the island of New Guinea and its near islands. And many of them have no grammatical relationship with any other language in the world. So these are called linguistic isolates. So it's a whole different way of conceptualizing and translating thought into words that doesn't exist in any other language. So multiply that little sample, I'm sure she has more than 5 words for forest, by 1,300, and you have just the island of New Guinea. And then think about the 350 languages of the Amazon, all the languages of the boreal forests and the Congo Basin. And these forest languages have this incredible bottomless repository of ways to think about forest. So I'm just going to read a tiny bit from the book here about what happens if we lose that. So for the translators, this is the one that starts, if West Papua. If West Papua's woods become splintered and their cultures uprooted, the Mebra ideas of forest, tof, arin, atrau, and mas, and the Nden of the neighboring Abun people, who speak another linguistic isolate, risk fusion into the Indonesian hutan, a forest with no local roots or resonance. Forest peoples will be left with a splintered forest and compelled to talk about it in a trade language of seafaring Malayans, a tongue that is Indonesia's lingua franca, thanks in part to its lack of intricacy. Each lost language narrows our view, not only of forests, but of the world. There's an ethical imperative to avoid the identity-wrecking loss of megaforests, and also pragmatic sense in refraining from burning libraries of forest knowledge just when our planet's stability needs the most. And the next slide I put in here, just to show you a speaker of the neighboring language, the Abun language, which is another, as I said in the text, another linguistic isolate. They're neighbors, their languages have no common source, and this pattern is repeated all over New Guinea. So our indigenous fellow travelers on Earth have the knowledge that we need for this task of saving the world's big forests. They also have the will. And in this image, our friend Beto Marubo, who's in the room just down the hall here, is standing with a man named Waki Mayuruna, also known as Kaisuma, one of the great chiefs of the Mayuruna people. So these two peoples are historical rivals, and we narrate in the book, actually Beto narrates in the book, the story of how in the early 2000s, they came together to defend their territory against a common enemy, which really is the surrounding economy and the mainstream society that surrounds often indigenous territories and is putting continuous pressure on them. So I'm not going to tell that whole story. You have to read the book to hear it. But they've continued with this work, and particularly in the last 3 years, which have been maybe, well, one could say an all-time low, at least in recent decades, for government commitment to the protection of indigenous land rights in Brazil. They've had to fall back on their own resources and stand up indigenous patrol teams in their territory, which is called the Vale do Javari in Brazil. And this is an incredibly significant place because not only are there tribes that have interaction, like the Mayuruna and the Maruba tribe of Beto, with surrounding society, but there are also at least 10 groups of people who live in voluntary isolation, so-called uncontacted tribes with which they share territory. So the work they're doing is of transcendental importance. And Beto has some wonderful comments in the book about the difference between a forest that has its people in it there to defend it and a forest that doesn't. And just as my last slide, I've got a picture of what that forest looks like. This is a Samauma tree in the western part of the Javari Valley, which it's 8.5 million hectares of forest. It's just a mind-blowingly large place. And this was from a opportunity I got to fly over it. And you can't believe as you're flying over this place that it just keeps going and going. But the Samauma, a big tree like this in emergent, in a more accessible, more fragmented forest would be gone. The biggest trees are gone. And these trees are not just interesting big organisms, they're sacred to many of the peoples who inhabit these forests. So I'm just going to close my remarks with another reading and then pass it over to Beto and Angela for their remarks. So let me preface this by just saying that the book is not only about Indigenous guardianship of these ecosystems.
Recording in progress.
That's a core part of the book. But we also talk about, what's the role of protected areas? What's the role of better planning for roads and other infrastructure? What might be the role of carbon markets and reforestation? So there is a practical policy kind of tone to what we come up with. And so the reading starts here. These strategies hold promise for a future in which vibrant, planet-sustaining forests will benefit the lives of descendants so distant they won't know our names. But saving the megaforest requires more than strategy and tactics. This is a job that needs to be done with feeling. In the modern world, the beings and features of the forest and even the forests themselves are commonly thought of as objects. We humans are separate subjects acting upon them, and nearly all verbs, if we think of this grammatically, are ethically tolerable. Cut, dig, clear, gather, manage, thin, burn. This separation is rare among forest peoples. Little Anastasia Momo's family may go back 50,000 years in New Guinea's forests. Like most clans here, the Momos have an origin story reaching into a pre-human realm. They identify black cockatoos, like the ones flying around us on this hillside in the Tembra Mountains, as ancestors. Nearby clans ascribe that role to tree kangaroos or masked snakes, creatures with whom long unbroken lines of ancestors have shared the forest shade. People we have met over the years and others we interviewed for this book repeat refrains about kinship and obligation to the various forms of non-human forest life that sustain them. Accounts abound about times when people and animals were fully conversant in the same language. Some still talk. For modern humanity to keep the megaforests and with them the one planet we know of that has any forests, we need to care for the world as if it is family. We need to attempt a grammar in which subject and object, people, and everything else are the same. In a material and evolutionary sense, of course, we absolutely are. So thank you for listening, everybody. And I guess I'll pass it next to Beto for his remarks, and then Angela, and then Pavel.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Olá a todos e a todas. Eu quero dizer a todos vocês que eu tenho a honra, primeiro, de ter o John como um amigo pessoal, né, nesse período, além de trabalharmos junto, e ter contribuído, uma pouca contribuição para essas reflexões que constam no livro, que eu acho ser fundamental no atual contexto, né, de mudanças climáticas e demais situações que estamos vendo agora, que vem influenciando na vida das pessoas no mundo inteiro, né? Eu sou Beto Marubo, sou da segunda maior terra indígena do país. Ela é quase do tamanho de Portugal, segundo dados cartográficos. Então, é uma terra que, relativamente, em relação a outras terras do Brasil, ela vem sendo protegidas. Não porque o governo quer que ela seja protegida, mas é a localização geográfica dela, onde ela está localizada, que meio que protege ela naturalmente. Nós chamamos de difícil acesso. Não é fácil acessar essa área, mas que, infelizmente, assim como outras grandes regiões do Brasil, outras terras indígenas e biomas, ela vem sendo atingida por essa busca desenfreada, né, de recursos humanos, né? E eu quero começar também a minha conversa por uma terminologia marubo, que ela fala o seguinte: chavá. Chavá, que nós chama, é nossa casa, que ela se resume, ela implicitamente resume três terminologias. Uma é casa, vida, casa e terra. Chavá. Então, por exemplo, a casa, o chavá nosso envolve a natureza, a as nossas florestas. O chavá é o seguinte: as caças que nós nos alimentamos, elas dependem das frutas que caem das árvores, né? Os igarapés, as cabeceiras do igarapés que nos dão água, eles também nascem entre as árvores, né? O ar que nós respiramos, eles também são purificados pelas árvores. E a terra, que é o elemento final, ela nos dá a plantação, o resultado do nosso esforço para fazer as roças, que nos alimentam também. E nós, marubos, lá do Vale do Javari, a gente não compreende como é que vocês, brancos, né, lidam com as florestas, tentando dissociar uma coisa da outra, né? E isso vem causando a destruição do nosso planeta, porque exatamente o conceito de floresta para vocês é um elemento dissociado, algo assim. Nós vemos lá no Brasil, apesar de ser um país que produz muito commodities, né? Eles não levam em consideração, é uma mentalidade totalmente burra, a meu ver, onde eles destroem a natureza para se beneficiar apenas de um desses elementos que eu falei, né? Vida, terra, vida, floresta e terra, né? Eles tentam ver a terra dissociada da floresta e por isso eles estão acabando com a maior parte dos nossos biomas, né? Então, é uma coisa que não é uma lógica que nós marubos, nós indígenas do Vale do Javari, não compreendemos. É uma lógica que vem, uma forma de atuação dos brancos que vem destruindo o planeta em todo o mundo e nós estamos numa situação agora onde nós mesmos estamos nos matando. Isso não entra na cabeça da minha família, né? Como eles esquecem da importância da floresta e tentam priorizar apenas a terra para plantar, né? Se algo está associado ao outro, né? Então, a importância desses biomas vem sendo demonstrada todos os dias para todos nós, né, do mundo inteiro. Mas, infelizmente, eu não vejo perspectiva nenhuma dos governantes, das autoridades, estarem discutindo isso de forma séria. A guerra da Ucrânia nos demonstrou isso. Nós tivemos agora na COP26, né, vários parentes lá participando, e muitas autoridades disseram, não, nós temos prioridades para próximos séculos para diminuir o carbono. E aí, lá pelas tantas, com a guerra da Rússia, percebemos que muitos países ainda continuavam ainda dependendo do petróleo, né? Ou seja, era apenas uma retórica, eles não estavam planejando coisíssima nenhuma, né? Eles iam continuar assim, protelando daqui a 10, daqui a 20, daqui a 30 anos. Ou seja, não há uma discussão séria no mundo hoje, a não ser pequenas situações irrelevantes que não vão diminuir esse processo, do meu ponto de vista. De um marubo que está aqui em Nova York, que está ouvindo, que participa das discussões com relação às mudanças climáticas, né? Mas os meus tios, meus parentes que estão lá na aldeia, acham isso ridículo. É uma visão burra de sobreviver num planeta único, né? Então, eu espero ter contribuído com a discussão sobre a importância dessas florestas, né, que estão descritas no livro. Eu acredito que é uma reflexão muito pertinente no atual momento em que vivemos no planeta. Obrigado, John, pela oportunidade.
Olá, bom dia a todos. Como fui apresentada, meu nome é Ângela, sou do povo Carriana, da terra indígena Cachuiana Tunaiana, no extremo norte do país, né, na fronteira Brasil com Suriname. Quero parabenizar ao John e aos demais que participaram dessa sistematização de tantos conhecimentos, né, de conhecimentos diversos de várias partes do mundo, que traz uma reflexão extremamente importante e única, né, do que se resume sobre a importância de ter as florestas, né, protegidas, associados à proteção de vida. Eu quero trazer uma reflexão de que muitos autores, muitos formadores de opiniões trazem sobre de que os povos indígenas são guardiões da floresta. Será que a gente não provoca, não passa a refletir o contrário de que as florestas são os guardiões das nossas vidas? Eu acho que é necessário trazer uma reflexão, um debate, uma análise mais crítica nesse sentido. Vamos pensar o inverso, de que se não há uma existência dessas florestas, né, protegidas, né, que elas sejam vistas como protetores das nossas vidas, não só dos povos indígenas, porque a gente está falando, inclusive, muitas imagens mostram de que o equilíbrio do clima, ela depende, né, da preservação dessas florestas. E quando a gente fala de florestas, é importante também de ter um olhar mais profundo. A gente não está falando de árvores em pés, literalmente, só isso, né? Quando a gente fala de floresta, a proteção da floresta, a gente está falando de proteger a diversidade de vidas, né? Isso. Eu acho que parto de uma reflexão aqui, provocando a todos aqui, e eu espero que, através do livro, as pessoas tenham a oportunidade de abrir esse pensamento, de que nós não somos os guardiões das florestas, as florestas são nossos guardiões. Porque sem a floresta nós não temos uma garantia de vida, nós não temos garantia do equilíbrio do clima, nós não temos garantia de ter água potável, nós não temos garantia e mínima de sobrevivência enquanto humanidade, sem essa preservação. E o contrário é possível. As florestas podem continuar vivendo sem a gente, sem os humanos? Claro, é possível, mas o inverso não é. Eu acho que a gente precisa agora partir de uma reflexão de que as florestas são os guardiões dos povos indígenas, da humanidade, né? Trazendo essa reflexão. É impressionante quando a gente viaja, né, no âmbito de ver algumas imagens, do quão a importância com a floresta, com esse... independente do tipo de florestas, porque é isso mesmo no Brasil, né? Há essa diversidade, tem florestas, né, ombrófilas densas, florestas em transição, cerrado, que tem a mesma importância de outras florestas aí que a gente fala, né? Eu acho que esse é um outro ponto de reflexão que é necessário trazer, de que a floresta não é só as árvores em pé, é um conjunto do que compõe essa garantia das nossas vidas. E relacionado, né, de uma outra reflexão que nós, enquanto povos indígenas do Brasil, a gente tem uma luta muito antiga, que é um pouco, talvez, diferenciado em relação a outras partes do mundo, né, em relação dos direitos indígenas, sobre demarcação de territórios indígenas, né? E há um questionamento muito grande, inclusive pela sociedade brasileira não indígena, de que para que demarcar tanto o território indígena, né? Porque as pessoas têm uma relação, um vínculo com a terra muito monetarizada, né? No Brasil sempre dizem ter muita terra para pouco índio. E o sentido para nós não é essa, de monetarizar ou comercializar pelo tamanho do território que temos, né? De que a garantia de demarcar um território é garantir demarcar a vida das pessoas que diretamente dependem, né, da manutenção dessas florestas, para ter um ar minimamente equilibrado, para ter as garantias, né, dos mananciais, para poder ter né, o direito de viver, inclusive, enquanto povo indígena, que é associado, né, a essa, não só de vínculo físico, material com a floresta em si, mas da própria sobrevivência cultural, espiritual, que é um outro viés, que tem uma interligação muito mais forte para nós enquanto povos indígenas. Então, a partir dessa pouca reflexão, gostaria aí, inclusive, convidar os outros indígenas, né? O Pavel, que é da Rússia, espero que junto nós possamos, Pavel, não só sensibilizar ao governo da Rússia, mas inclusive o governo brasileiro não é diferente, né, do seu país, infelizmente, de que valorizar a vida dos povos indígenas, conservar os territórios indígenas é a única saída para a sobrevivência da humanidade. E há tempo ainda. Nós, enquanto povos indígenas, temos alertado ao mundo inteiro de que a única forma de garantir o equilíbrio, né, do clima que está em crise é reconhecer os conhecimentos tradicionais dos povos indígenas. Então, sintam-se abraçados por nós, vocês, enquanto povos indígenas de todo o mundo, e de que possamos trazer esse recado, esse pensamento a toda a humanidade, para que realmente possam levar a sério o que nós temos falado há muito tempo sobre a mudança do clima, que a única salvação disso é conservar os territórios indígenas, é preservar as florestas. Então, é isso. Muito obrigada.
Thank you so much, Angela and Beto, for your incredible remarks. And I think it really connects beautifully to what John has said, and we've already diving into this, into merging these different perspectives with one common goal. Thank you so much. Now we give the word to Pavel. Julian, can you try to unmute and see if we can hear you, Pavel? Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Меня слышно? Спасибо огромное Джону, спасибо большое UNDP за такую возможность. Очень важный разговор, за ту книгу, которую Джон написал. Мне особенно также приятно, что я участвую в нашем разговоре с нашими братьями и сестрами из Амазонии. Я являюсь представителем народа УДГ. УДГ – это означает, что лесные люди. Мой народ – это лесной народ. Я могу сказать, что очень кратко вот история, да, что когда-то раньше, еще в 20 веке, совсем недавно, мой народ был, это 8 групп, да, 8 групп, которые жили на разных 8 реках в окружении нашей природы и нашей тайги, нашей уссурийской тайги. И где-то, вот, начиная с 50-х годов до конца 70-х годов, в 50-х годах как раз на нашей территории, на ряд территорий наших групп удыгейцев пришла лесная промышленность. И вот с периода с 50-х годов по конец 70-х 4 группы моего народа не стало, они исчезли. То есть никто не проводил политику геноцида, да, нас никто не убивал. Просто у этих 4 групп удыгейцев вырубили тайгу. И эти 4 группы, они исчезли, они растворились. Большая часть тех удыгейцев, у которых вырубили тайгу, они перешли вот к нам. Я сам представляю группу УДГ, народа УДГ Бикин-Т. То есть это удыгейцы, которые живут на реке Бикин. И почему мне особенно приятно, что вот я сегодня участвую в разговоре с своими братьями и сестрами из Амазонии, потому что Бикин учеными, международными учеными называется как российская Амазонка. Дело в том, что в северном полушарии река Бикин, да, и наша уссурийская тайга считается самым местом, где самое большое биоразнообразие. Обычно, в принципе, считается, что северная природа, она как бы из того, что очень холодно и так далее, связано с климатическими изменениями. Конечно, нет такого большого биоразнообразия, как в Амазонии, как на юге, но именно у нас на Бикине, на нашей реке, считается, сошелся север и юг. Да. На нашей территории есть эндемики, да, и флоры, и фауны, которые могут жить и расти только на севере. И могут жить и расти только на юге. А вот на нашей территории, на реке, на нашей Бикин, территории моего народа, это все живет в одном месте. И поэтому мне очень приятно, что сегодня я также слушаю, и очень для меня созвучно то, что как думают и говорят представители коренных народов из Амазонии. И я хотел бы сказать, что вот мы очень долго, история моего народа, да, это в последние годы, это история борьбы, сохранения нашего Бикина, нашей уссурийской тайги. На территории моего народа нашли какие только полезные ископаемые. Да. Естественно, к сожалению, промышленники, бизнес, власти приходят и все хотят отобрать, все хотят добыть там, и так далее, и так далее. И нам удалось буквально совсем недавно, это примерно лет 7 назад, договориться с федеральным правительством. И на нашей территории мы договорились о создании национального парка Бикин, да, где ввели соуправление коренных народов, соуправление моего народа вместе с федеральным правительством. И это стало возможным благодаря еще тому, что так как наша территория, мы ее сохранили в нетронутом виде, да, там нет никакой промышленности, на нашей территории очень большое количество проживает амурских тигров. Да, это священное животное для моего народа, это тотемное животное. Поэтому удалось добиться того, что сейчас наша территория находится в Казахстане и находится в нашем соуправлении. Поэтому, конечно же, я буду очень рад, чтобы, мне кажется, было бы важно, если коренных народов Амазонии, я так, извините, выражусь, да, представители моего народа, которые живут на Бикине, которые называют российской Амазонией, могли бы обмениваться, встречаться, может быть, поделиться опытом, чтобы мой народ увидел, как вы живете, чтобы вы увидели, как живет мой народ. Мне кажется, важно, здорово, и чтобы мы вместе могли продвигать эту идею, которую высказали, вместе бороться, вместе солидаризироваться, сохранять леса, которые на самом деле важны не только для наших народов, и которые мы сохраняем не только для себя, но и в целом для всего человечества. Спасибо большое за возможность с вами поговорить.
Thank you so much, Father. And now we're gonna have our last panelist, Stephanie Wang from WCS, and she's gonna talk a little bit more about the work that the Forest for Life Partnership is doing in relation to intact forests. Stephanie, you have the floor.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm here representing WCS, but also I would want to talk a little bit about the Forest for Life Partnership, which is a collaboration between 5 organizations, which is WCS, the World Resources Institute, Rewild, UNDP, of course, and Rainforest Foundation Norway. Our mission is to place ecological integrity at the heart of strategies for managing and conserving all of the world's forests. But in particular, we aim to halt and reverse forest degradation across more than 1 billion hectares of the most intact forests worldwide. We've heard from all of our wonderful speakers why intact forests are so important. So forests are the guardians of the people. And from a climate regulation and resilience perspective, they're essential. So intact forests absorb around 1/4 of annual global human and global emissions. Without them, the world would be at least 0.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today. Globally, intact forests contain exceptional carbon stores as well. It's estimated around 139 billion tons of carbon in their biomass, which is equivalent to over 500 billion tons of CO2. And if you think about these stocks being released to the atmosphere, this represents the equivalent of 13 years of all human carbon emissions from all sources. So highly intact forests also provide important local climate, water, biodiversity, and livelihood benefits. And part of what we heard reaffirmed here is that intact forests also play an invaluable role in the cultural and economic rights of Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples are the inhabitants and stewards of well over 35% of the world's most intact forests. But this is using the intact forest landscapes data set that John mentioned, and play a central role in their conservation. Just one example, an FAO synthesis of over 250 academic studies found that in nearly every country in Latin America, Indigenous and tribal territories have lower deforestation rates than other forest areas. Another way of looking at the health of these forests is through the Forest Landscape Integrity Index, which is something that has been produced by the Forest for Life Partnership with over 45 forest experts from around the world. And I will try to share my screen here just to give you a sense of, okay, so. Okay, well, I work on that. I'll keep talking and then maybe I'll put it on at the end. So basically the Forest Landscape Integrity Index is the first measure of ecological integrity for all of the world's forests. This index integrates data on observed as well as inferred forest pressures and lost forest connectivity to generate the first globally consistent and continuous index of forest integrity as determined by degree of anthropogenic modification. So,
Stephanie, can you slow down a little bit?
Oh,
Because
I'm so sorry. I know I talk fast.
Thank you, Steph. You're on mute now. There you go.
Okay. Sorry, I know I tend to talk very fast. So the Forest Landscape Integrity Index shows that globally only 17.4 million square kilometers of forest, which is about 40%, can be considered to have high integrity. And of this, only 27% of this area is found in nationally designated protected areas. Of this 20%, only just over half are of these forests are considered to have high ecological integrity. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And we know that carbon stocks and sink functions will decrease as they are deforested and degraded, and these threats are accelerating rapidly. So by one measure, from 2000 to 2016, we lost about nearly 10% of the planet's most intact forests, or which is a rate of 0.6% per year. And this is higher than the rate of global deforestation during that time. The carbon impacts from these losses have been found to be really grossly underreported and are 6 times higher than previously thought. And at this rate, half of the world's intact forests will be cleared or seriously degraded by the end of this century. So as a result, Forest for Life, we've been particularly focused on how we can strengthen and enhance incentives for their protection. And to keep these forests continuing to sequester carbon at these rates as we attempt to keep warming within a 1.5 degree pathway. Something Rockstrom and al. Said in this 2020 paper was that a combination of local and Indigenous knowledge with international, technical, and financial support is vital for enabling effective stewardship. The main challenge is that there have been no meaningful market incentives for the protection of intact forests, other than pretty limited public funding, sometimes supported by philanthropy. No finance mechanism really creates the meaningful incentives that we need at the scale that's commensurate with the climate regulatory functions that these forests perform. And one study by Rainforest Foundation Norway, one of the Forest for Life partners, found that projects that support Indigenous people's tenure and forest management have received less than 1% of development assistance for climate mitigation and adaptation over the last decade. So therefore, it's essential that we support pathways for Indigenous peoples to gain access to meaningful incentives and recognition of the, in terms of climate finance, the climate benefits that their stewardship will deliver. But these incentives could support a broad range of actions. So not only improve legal recognition, transparency and governance, but also provide adequate resources to support Indigenous peoples to expand their legal claims to territorial ownership, secure forest tenure at a large scale, and also to strengthen management processes to address these external threats. On the interest of time here, I'll stop, but I'll put the Forest Landscape Integrity Index link and also the Forest for website in the chat for those interested in exploring this tool and some of the policy approaches for finance that we are developing with our partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was very interesting. A lot of information, a lot of data there in a very short time. But as she said, she's putting the resources in the chat so you can look at that again after the event. And I think it's interesting to have this combination of scientific information and traditional knowledge, and how the two can be complemented with each other. So now we're gonna transition to the question and answers session of this event. But before doing that, I would like to invite maybe John, if you want to provide some initial reflections and comments after hearing from the panelists.
Yeah,
the floor is yours.
Well, I want to thank the panelists again. It's again, we tried to bring so much these different streams of information into the book. We tried to cover the whole world, and any one of these forests is a world unto itself. And so having their generous, opening their minds and sharing with us what they know and what they think about these forests has made the book possible. And I wanted to reflect on Angela's comment about which way does this go? Are people the guardians of the forest, or forests the guardians of the people? And when we were proposing this book to publishers or preparing a pitch for the book, it was hard for us to explain this in a way that people who weren't familiar with the subject matter could understand, because it's like a spiral where a spiral of reciprocity, I guess you could say, where the forest is the thing that holds the people who are holding the forest, or at least that was my conclusion. And so we end up sort of with two chapters that address the two sides of this issue. And another thing I wanted to reflect on is sort of picking up on Stephanie's remark about how little of the forest is under official protection. There is a real tension in the Indigenous movement about protected areas, and about protected areas often being an imposed idea, but one that has not just conceptual impacts, it has real impacts on livelihoods. And there in the process of reporting for the book, what I saw anyway, is really interesting attempts to fuse the ideas of Indigenous guardianship with this very modern idea of the protected area. And maybe in Canada, more than any other place, the ideas about Indigenous protected areas are taking off. And I mean, throughout my career, I've seen these powerful combinations of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous scientists working together. And as two different cultures with a common practice of looking at things really closely and really carefully over long periods of time, and this empiricism driving strategies for protection that are really based on reality, more than based on ideology or ideas that are cooked up far away from the forest. So I think that's a hopeful thing. And we saw in the early 2000s, the categories of protected areas, for example, in the Amazon, which is where protected forests expanded more than any place else, the categories proliferated too. So there are more tools to fit protection into the social fabric of the forest. It's the human social fabric of the forest, which is going to be the only way that humanity gets to the sort of goals of protection that I think were implicit in what Stephanie was saying, because there are a lot of people out there. And when you start looking at maps, so where can we protect forests? There are people all those places. There's an estimate that something like 1 billion people living in the territories where protection ideally would expand. So that's going to be an important challenge. And I think the other thing I just wanted to reflect on is the success that Pavel's people have had in the Pekin River Valley is quite unique. And we were chatting about this yesterday in Russia, which Russia has the biggest forest in the world. There are laws on the books for areas of traditional nature use, and Pavel was instrumental in getting those on the books, but they're not implemented. So there's a huge unmet need for Indigenous communities to be exercising the kind of shared control that the Undigetz people have on their land. So I'd leave my reflections at that, and just love to hear from folks what questions they have.
Great, thank you so much, John. And that example of these innovative protected areas that are in line with Indigenous peoples' territorial governance, I think that's really an important way for the future. And I'm just thinking of my own country, Bolivia, where we have Ñemby Guazú, an indigenous protected area that has been created up from their request, and where IOREO contacted indigenous peoples are. So, and one indigenous group protecting uncontacted indigenous groups through an indigenous managed protected area. It's really something we wouldn't have seen 20 years ago, but it's an interesting model that could be hopefully expanded and enhanced as well. So we have
Speaking of that, we can turn to
yeah, exactly. So so we can just turn with that. But I think they turn off the camera. Angela and Beto, can you turn your camera back on? And it's a couple of questions specifically for you. So the first one is, how do you balance the local work you do in your communities with the global advocacy job that you do, like you're doing here this week in New York? And the other question is how the issue of forest degradation is impacting uncontacted peoples in particular.
Há uma forma de séculos de nós lidarmos com o nosso local, né? Nosso chavá, como eu mencionei aí. Por exemplo, os marubos, eles não têm lugar onde eles moram mais do que 10 anos, apesar de que as situações agora estão exigindo isso, né? O governo coloca escola, coloca posto de saúde, são estruturas que nos atendem lá. Mas a gente escolher um lugar em específico para que as estruturas do governo permaneçam lá como referência de atendimento no interior da terra indígena. Porém, as aldeias, com as famílias, elas seguem um modo tradicional de mudar de lugar conforme a escassez dos recursos naturais. Então, a gente faz roça e, com o tempo, a roça, a terra fica pobre. Então, nós mudamos para outro lugar. Então, diminui a caça. Nós temos que diminuir e ir para outro lugar. E, com 2, 3 anos no máximo, as comunidades velhas, elas repovoam de novo. A floresta volta a ter a vida normal de novo, nesses lugares onde a gente abandonou, que nós chamamos de capoeira, né? O pessoal chama de capoeira lá. E é o formato que os brancos chamam de... lá eles denominam... Como é que se chama? Repovoar as florestas, né?
Uhum.
Então, reocupação territorial, né? Então, nós temos essa questão lá acontecendo. Isso dessa forma que a gente lidar com essas florestas, com o nosso bioma, nossa região lá. E acreditamos que as mudanças climáticas, elas vêm afetando a temperatura nesses lugares. No período do verão, lá na minha terra, antes não tinha isso. A terra fica muito dura, fica muito seca e aumenta o número de folhas. Então, isso tem criado obstáculo para a plantação e algumas espécies de animais que nós consumimos em determinada época do ano estão muito magros. As árvores não estão dando fruto bom, muito como antigamente. E algumas espécies também não estão mais se procriando como era antes, segundo o levantamento lá das aldeias, né? Principalmente aves que dependem de frutos, né? O fruto ele já não dá em abundância como antigamente, né? E esse obstáculo que a floresta está criando agora, com muita folha, a gente não caça mais como a gente caçava com tranquilidade antes, porque antes de nós chegar no animal, ele metro já vai embora. Então, é um dos obstáculos que a gente está se adaptando lá na nossa região. Isso tudo devido às mudanças climáticas influenciando na nossa vida, lá no mato.
Bom, sobre a segunda pergunta, em termos gerais, o que o desflorestamento causa à vida dos povos indígenas, não só o desequilíbrio do clima, mas é uma ameaça direta à vida dos povos indígenas. Isso também nós entendemos que é uma forma de genocídio, porque como é que os povos indígenas vão viver toda essa relação que anteriormente mencionei sem a existência das florestas, né? Além de a contaminação dos rios, né? O avanço dos grandes do agronegócio para os territórios indígenas também é um risco, que é uma consequência do desmatamento, né, da floresta, né? Sobre como é que a gente consegue equilibrar, né, a nossa atuação lá no local, no nosso território e nos espaços como esse, né? Beto e eu somos de uma organização indígena que justamente tem essa missão, né, de levar a voz das nossas comunidades, a realidade das nossas comunidades para um espaço, né, de denúncia, para o espaço de tentativa que o mundo ouça a nossa voz, né? Então, essa é a nossa missão. Não é fácil, principalmente nesse governo atual, não é fácil ser líder indígena, não é fácil ser membro de uma organização indígena que tem esse papel, porque lá nos nossos territórios sofremos ameaças de morte, sofremos perseguições, né? Mas essa é a nossa missão, né? Como falamos, lutaremos até o último povo indígena, se preciso for dessa forma, se o mundo não se alertar e preferir dizimar novamente os povos indígenas em nome de uma economia para poucos, em nome da cobiça, né, dos não indígenas sobre os nossos recursos, sobre as nossas vidas, inclusive.
Eu queria só explicar um pouco uma fala que eu não terminei o pensamento. O que nós fazemos lá, como eu falei, de mudar os lugares para repovoar posteriormente, é plano de manejo. O português lá os brasileiros chamam plano de manejo, né, que eles chamam. O que nós fazemos isso naturalmente lá no nosso território. É uma forma que a gente deixa as comunidades sempre utilizando a região sem agredir o meio ambiente, né? Ao contrário das plantações e habitações fora da terra indígena, né? Que elas destroem esses lugares e muito deles não tem vida mais, passa a ser inabitável. Essa é a conclusão do meu pensamento.
Great. Thank you, Angela and Beto. That was excellent. And now we have a question for Pavel. The question is, the example you shared about protecting the national park is really inspiring. And it's important to share that story with others. Can you please share the key lessons that led to this success so that other communities could learn from it? Thanks.
Меня слышно?
Да.
Да, конечно. Я думаю, что, конечно же, наша победа, да, наша работа по
1 second, Pavel, sorry, the translation is not
защите нашей территории, наших лесов, нашей тайги не была бы возможной, если не было, мне кажется, несколько ключевых причин, да, очень важных для нашей победы. Первое – это единство народа. Когда мы начали строить нашу позицию, да, как нам защититься, ведь нас очень мало, да, наш народ очень малочисленный, мы договорились сразу, что мы должны бороться все вместе. Я помню, как я тогда сказал своим соплеменникам, что мы должны быть вместе, мы должны доверять друг другу, что если будет один человек выступать, 10 человек выступать, 100 человек выступать, нас либо посадят, либо уничтожат, да, и так далее. Если мы станем все вместе, весь народ станет, то тогда нас не уничтожат, нас не смогут, наш голос будет слышен. И я могу сказать, что мы всегда этого придерживались. Например, меня 4 раза приезжали в мою общину снимать с работы региональные власти, районные власти. Они это делали специально, когда я уезжал на встречи, на различные мероприятия. Приезжали, они снять меня не могли, потому что меня выбрал народ. Но эти представители власти приезжали в мою деревню, в мою общину и говорили, что вы знаете, вот Павел, он такой плохой, он вас предал, он вас продал, он договаривается с разными компаниями и так далее, и так далее. Поэтому вы снимаете его, он очень плохой. Да? Но, на что мои люди, да, мои соплеменники отвечали властям. Знаете, что он все равно вернется в деревню. Здесь его семья, здесь его дети, да, здесь его родные. И мы с ним поговорили. И если мы узнаем, что он нас предал, он нас продал, мы с ним сами разберемся, мы его утопим в нашем бикини. Так что не волнуйтесь, мы сами будем разбираться. Это было очень важно, потому что власти пытались проводить эту политику, разделять нас, разделять и обманывать. Это первое, да, что вот эта вот солидарность, доверие между членами общины, что мы были вместе. Второе, конечно, для нас было очень важно найти союзников. Мы проводили очень большую работу, здесь нам очень сильно помогли экологические организации, ученые, с которыми мы общались, с которыми мы обращались. Они писали нам очень много разных обоснований, почему, для чего, как и так далее. Нас поддержали местные жители. Мы вместе с местными жителями проводили пикетирование Белого дома в столице нашего региона и так далее. Вот эта поддержка, большая поддержка со стороны гражданского общества, ученых, экологов была очень-очень для нас важна. И третье, конечно, как мне кажется, тоже является одним из важнейших факторов, это то, что, это я говорю всегда, это политика наших дедов, которую они начали проводить где-то в середине 20 века, да, когда мой народ получил доступ к образованию. И вот наши деды говорили, что вы, молодежь, должны получить образование. Неважно, кем и где будете вы работать. Будете ли вы продолжать традиционные охоты, рыболовство и так далее, но образованным быть обязан. Я могу сказать, что у меня два брата, моих двоюродных, они закончили университет политехнический, они по специальности инженера, они некоторое время работали по специальности, сейчас они охотники у меня на родине. Почему это важно? Потому что помимо всех сторон жизни, да, сохранения нашей природы, культуры и так далее, социальные вопросы, есть еще экономические вопросы. И для нас было очень важно, чтобы в нашем управлении нашей общины принимали участие квалифицированные специалисты. Это специалисты были наши, которые были образованными, которые в то время болели за свой народ, которые хотели его развития, которые это развитие делали. И вот эти очень важные моменты, да, которые, как мне кажется, и помогли нам вот, победить и выстоять в этой борьбе. Спасибо.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for highlighting the role of authentic leadership, partnerships, education, and capacity building as key ingredients for your incredible efforts. We're going to finish with two questions for Stephanie. We have one regarding the role of finance. How is the Forest for Life Partnership working to help create more incentives and drive finance for intact forest protection? And the second question relates to the biodiversity credits being promoted at the last COP conference. Do you think they might be a part of the solution to the lack of funding for the protection of intact forests and indigenous peoples' territories?
Okay, so very good questions. I think I tried to answer the one about biodiversity credits in the chat. Just briefly, I think those have been attempted at a project scale and piloted, but we haven't heard much about that being attempted at a scale really needed. I think our focus has been more on carbon finance because the most available finance is in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so Forest for Life, we have been developing as a group a number of policy approaches to expand and strengthen and enhance climate incentives for intact forests. And a lot of that necessarily must include approaches for Indigenous territorial management. And that's on our website. If you click through policy approaches, there are a number of main ones, including performance-based finance. So that's basically not dependent on, for a result where you're avoiding a ton of carbon being emitted, for example. And there's also some new developments in the voluntary carbon market that could be used by Indigenous peoples to better access those, because it's been sort of the REDD+ mechanism and the UNFCCC has been basically has not been structured in a way that rewards the protection of standing forests. And so those are some that are new in development, but haven't yet been tested or implemented yet. So I think, there's a lot of discussion on what could be some approaches and ideas being developed, but nothing that's been attempted at scale yet. So this is a pretty exciting time. And I think it would be great to incorporate some of these ideas and the ways of thinking and that John and others have mentioned in their book. But yes,
Great.
please refer to the website. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I think with that, we're about to close now. It's hard to summarize all what has been said in these 2 hours. My mind is still processing, but I think two things come to my mind, and I think the book exemplifies this in a very powerful way. The importance of having a narrative that incorporates, that has the feeling that John have mentioned, that bring, because we've been working on these issues for so many years, but if we don't incorporate the passion and feeling that is needed to drive the agenda forward at the scale and at the speed we need in this decade, we're not gonna succeed. And the second point is related to the Indigenous people's fundamental role as not only guardians, but I think as leaders in this space, and who in partnership with conservationists and with other allies could really show the way forward. And lastly, what Angela mentioned and John highlighted again, the role of forests as guardians of the humanity. I think that's a really powerful message, and it would be great to expand through the partnerships that we have, through the Forest for Life partnership, or through the Forest Declaration partnership. I think this message is very important and can resonate with the larger society. And finally, just to reiterate here at UNDP, we're being very honored to host you all in this event. And offer the Forest Declaration platform as a space where we could continue these conversations, we can build and expand and scale up these partnerships that we need to keep working together on this very important issue. Thank you very much for your presence this morning. Gracias, obrigado. Thank you, Pavel.
Spasiba, Pavel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, for being here. Thank you, Claire, for moderating.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Nina,
colleagues.
and our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming.
Yes.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful day. Thank you to our team for supporting in the background. Maddie and Mariana, thank you, everyone. And to all the interpreters, thank you
Yes.
to all the interpreters for the
Thank
great
you.
work always. Really appreciate having you here. Thank you.